Welcome to the Media Roundtable, special edition, where we dive into the secret craft and provide our perspective on industry topics in service of the Chief Audio Officer. Who is the Chief Audio Officer? It is marketers responsible for the success of their audio program. We know it's a narrow lane, but that's what makes podcasts so great. I'm your host, Jennifer Laine, and today we're going in two totally different directions. For those of you in the audience who have been listening since the very beginning, we're doing a little bit of a throwback to 2020, where our episodes were dedicated to sitting down with leading founders, CEOs, and CMOs to hear firsthand about their path to growth, the path they've carved through their company, or carved for their company, by investing in audio, as well as getting a bit of inside baseball, hearing them share how they're thinking about continuing to explore opportunities in the future. In this conversation, which took place at our CAO Summit in LA last month, Dan Granger sat down with Allan Jones, founder and CEO of Bambee, former CMO of ZipRecruiter, to dive into topics ranging from broad discussions such as Allan's approach to decision-making and relationship marketing to more granular topics like advice for brand marketers on how to structure audio campaigns with shifting KPIs. But that's part 2 of this episode. So before we get into that, we're shifting our focus from our Brand Marketers Summit to another event, the all-important industry event, which took place last week, Podcast Movement Conference in Denver. And joining me in this debrief, we have an elite group of boots on the ground attendees and speakers who are going to share what went down. Welcome back to the show, our dear friend, James Cridland, editor at Podcast Business Journal and Podnews.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Stephen Abraham, president of Oxford Road.
Hello, always a pleasure.
Miranda, one of not only a star from the stage at Podcast Movement, but also VP of Media Operations at Oxford Road.
Hello.
And for the very first time, a very warm welcome to the show, Julia Palermo, media buyer at Oxford Road.
Excited to be here.
And Ashlei Kramer, media planner at Oxford Road.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thrilled to have all of you guys. I think the first place to start would be with you, Miranda. You took to the stage. Dan did, Kristen did, others on our team, but we're thrilled to have you today. Can you share a little bit with our audience about what talking points you delivered from the stage in Denver?
Yeah, so the panel I participated in was titled, "What do the biggest performance buyers want?" And it was focused on how the podcast industry, it evolved too fast. So in terms of migrating over to dynamic ad insertion. So over the last few years, we saw a lot of money being invested in the space. Publishers were paying top dollar to acquire talent. And that put immense pressure on the publishers to maximize revenue as much as possible. So as buyers, we could feel this hyper focus on monetization. And unfortunately, it came at the expense of existing advertisers. When publishers rush to execute DAI, oftentimes without due diligence and vetting or developing tech capabilities, things like frequency capping. And so as a result, buyers across the industry have been seeing issues like high concentration, late inserts, which impact performance. And therefore our ability to scale, particularly with publishers who are the biggest vendors. So I actually stated some numbers on the panel for any publishers that are listening, and I think it's worth sharing again. So just taking a few of those publishers, our spend is down with them anywhere from 50 to 73%. And in some cases, that's well over $1 million. Now you multiply that, with other agencies and advertisers, and it could be costly. So, but overall, it was assuring to hear that our esteemed competitors, as well as BetterHelp, have all been in the same boat, experiencing the same frustrations. And it was just great for us to come together and share the implications of those issues and give a call to action to publishers to solve these issues and in a more timely manner.
So the beauty of podcast movement that we touched upon last week is a lot of the really hard conversations happen sort of over happy hour in the room. After us and some of our competitors and even brands who are buying direct voice some of those concerns, what was the general temperature at these happy hours with the networks who may have been sort of the biggest offenders, without naming any names?
Yeah, no names. I actually was relieved because, I heard people address the issues and empathize with us and say, listen, if I were in your shoes, I would be just as frustrated. I would be upset. I would be doing the same thing that you guys are doing. So like, first and foremost, it's always great when there's that acknowledgement, because I think, at least from my perspective, like it's been rare, and it's hard to have those conversations over Zoom, especially when you don't have that kind of relationship with some of the people on the more technical side. I will also say I was relieved for the acknowledgement, and also to learn that they are taking very specific steps to fix it. But like I said, and I think they admitted, it's not happening fast enough. It's just been really slow.
Well, reassuring to see some positive steps forward, even if this road is going to be a little bit longer or a little bit slower than we had anticipated.
If I could just add to that,
go ahead.
I think I spoke to a couple of publishers, not necessarily in happy hours. I mean, there were probably slightly more unhappy hours in some of these cases. I would say that a couple of them did sort of say that they had recalled a lot of these conversations from previous conferences that we've all had the opportunity to attend, and that there was serious intent by a lot of industry folk to start to turn this corner and shift focus towards more broader communication issues, such as how do we start to think about diminishing ad load, what's going to be ways that we can start introducing more robust third-party verification and standardization. But they also said that they got caught a little bit blindsided as well by the reverse downturn in the economy sometime towards October or November of last year, which a lot of us on the agency side, brand side, and indeed publisher side felt. And so as all of us, they kind of pivoted more to sort of, how do we fix the short term rather than looking at some of those long-term problems? So I don't think it was for any ill will of not wanting to address it. I just think that they had to pivot as businesses, as many of us had to.
Yeah, and a lot of that was happening, I guess, in real time, and we wouldn't know what the extent of the results would be. But now that we're seeing them, we're faced with some data that we can't ignore.
Exactly, and green shoots are beginning to be seen again. We sort of mentioned this at the top of this just prior to starting recording, and we'll probably get into it. But I'm hopeful and confident that we'll start to get back on the track of seeing those conversations arise again.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com.
I guess another conversation that we've talked about on the podcast a bit, and we haven't really dove deep into yet in a more concerted way, but Julia, I know your time at Podcast Movement, you wanted to speak about one of the hot topics that was sort of on the tip of everybody's tongue, and that was simulcast. How about, as a starting point, what do we mean when we say simulcast?
Yeah, so when we talk about simulcast, we're talking about the video portion of a podcast. So a lot of us, we consume our podcasts via audio, but more and more shows are adding a simulcast component, which could be by way of YouTube, Rumble, or even Twitter in some cases. And they're posting a video version of the show, which actually we've seen reaches a different audience than the audio listener. And we are seeing that these kind of 360 integrations have been working well for our performance clients. And we can do some creative things with that. We can use on-screen banners, clickable links, and depending on the client, we can do a product placement or a demonstration. And these integrations make the ads a bigger part of the show, and it's been super engaging for the audiences.
I would add to that, Julia, you're spot on. It's not only video, is it? It's any simultaneous sort of transmission of that. And James, you were mentioning that YouTube have just made a couple of announcements.
Yeah, they did. Steve McClendon was there at Podcast Movement, and he made a number of different announcements around podcasting on YouTube. And one of the things which was quite exciting is that they said that podcasting will be rolled out completely on that platform by the end of the year, which is nice, given that I'm in one of the many countries that doesn't yet have it. So that's always a good thing. He's also talked about it ingesting RSS audio feeds. It's the first time that they've talked about it. And I actually covered that back in May. But what ingesting RSS audio feeds, of course, means is that they're grabbing the audio and then they're rehosting that on YouTube. So very different in terms of getting any stats for audio advertising there. But nevertheless, it'll be a very easy tool for podcasters to end up using, or for creators to end up using. The other thing that he seemingly forgot to announce on stage, but he told me that he was going to announce, so therefore I had an exclusive, which was nice, was that the YouTube Music app will deal with RSS feeds directly. So if you are appearing on paid for podcasts, for example, through people like Supporting Cast or Supercast, then you'll be able to add those private RSS feeds to the YouTube Music app, and that is properly passed through. So you'll get all of the stats and data from that. So a bunch of announcements, I think, from YouTube, and it was really good to hear that they are really pushing forward with that particular service. And, there'll be podcasting available on one of the largest content platforms anywhere in the world, everywhere by the end of the year.
One question for me and maybe some in our audience is, what does advertising look across a YouTube podcast? How are those ads going to be placed? Are YouTube also going to be placing ads? If there's a live read in the ad, would that appear in the podcast episode on the YouTube channel? Do we have a good idea for what that looks like or will look like?
Well, certainly when you look at the upload terms and conditions, one of the things it says is that you can't have ads in podcasts when you upload them. So there's a thing. So, and by ads, they're really talking about a 30-second, shouty ad, that ends up being dropped in. Presenter live reads are all fine. So Those are
Okay.
absolutely good. You do need to flag those though as include as being in the podcast as you upload. So it's an interesting time. I think if you are a chief audio officer, you're looking at which ads you should be you should be making available. Well, the YouTube rules are a little bit different to the rest of everything else, and of course YouTube can put ads in front of those episodes, or even in the middle of those episodes as well. So I think it'll be interesting seeing how YouTube actually deal with all of that. But certainly, if you're buying live reads, then those can get onto YouTube quite happily, and those should work quite nicely, I think.
That's an augmentation of impressions, whereas it'll be interesting to see if YouTube starts selling ads within podcasts that aren't supposed to have 30-second insertions, and they start selling it as digital display, banners, or indeed additional,
well, they're doing mid rolls, pre rolls and mid rolls anyway. My suspicion about why they haven't made this available globally quite yet is that they're not selling audio ads quite yet in most countries. They've sold them in the US and Canada for some time, but because that's a great way for them to monetize YouTube Music, which is their music platform. And my suspicion is that that's one of the reasons why they haven't rolled out. I have to say, I put that to Steve at Google, and he said that wasn't the case. So probably my suspicion was wrong, but nevertheless. So I guess that there will be additional monetization that YouTube will be doing. Now, from my point of view, I'm curious as to whether or not they have any concept of brand, Solus brand or Solus category advertising, so that if there is a host read read from in a podcast that gets uploaded onto YouTube for an airline, would there be a automated ad that appears for a competing airline? Who knows? So I guess we should be, careful in terms of that. But very exciting, in terms of at least turning that feature on everywhere. And certainly when you look at other parts of the world, YouTube is massive. So I think it'll have a really nice impact in terms of the amount of people who find all of that content.
Yeah, and I know it's still sort of early days, all things considered, for simulcast. Julia, have we heard sort of how these simulcast ads are going for brands who are moving forward in that direction?
Yeah, in our experience at Oxford Road, simulcasts are performing extremely well. And especially with the audio industry trending more towards dynamic insertion, the simulcast component is a great way for performance brands to buy true baked-in spots that live in the content in perpetuity, which is a part of the reason why we're seeing so much success. But that is kind of the million-dollar question for performance marketers, is attribution, which we do not yet have. It does sound like these steps are getting us closer and closer with YouTube, but it's not here yet. But this year, Oxford Road has found a great way to innovate through the implementation of the second layer survey. We've had a great case study white paper come out earlier this year with the How Did You Hear About Us survey. And this has allowed us to not so heavily rely on the third-party pixel partners, and has helped us ensure that our buys are getting their fair share of credit for the results that they drive. And this has been huge for simulcast campaigns now that we can better understand performance, and it's really helping us bridge the gap while we wait for pixel attribution to catch up.
And we're seeing more and more of our clients adopting it across the.
Is there a better client for this or a worse client for this, or is everybody an equal opportunity contender for simulcast?
I think everybody's equal opportunity. I think there is a different audience that consumes shows via video or what have you. So I think that all clients should give it a shot. And as we wait for the attribution to catch up, the second layer survey has been very successful for us.
And for anyone who hasn't actually been able to read our white paper and is interested, just visit our website, oxfordroad.com, go to the thinking section, and it's right near the top. You'll see the white paper on attribution to download. James, you had mentioned sort of availability internationally. I know, Ashlei, international was a topic that really jumped out for you at Podcast Movement. It's something that our agency is touched upon both from chatting about it and even operationally in the last 12 to 18 months. What was the topic around international in Denver?
Yeah, so one of my main focuses while we were down there is to really meet with our international networks that flew in from Australia, UK, France, and being able to meet with them face to face and gain their perspective and work through obstacles. Because I do think that it can sometimes be easy for us to, lean on our US partners because that's who we have our relationship with and place internationally. But what I found by meeting with these networks that are boots on the ground in these markets, really gaining that knowledge that they were able to give me and understanding that performance advertising isn't prevalent there. It is more brand. So changing the way that you speak to the listeners is really important. And understanding that they haven't been exposed to URLs like we have with our American advertisers. We're always pushing URLs. They haven't been exposed to that. So just really even changing the way we speak to them was really just a big wealth of knowledge for me. And one of the things that stood out that one of the networks told me is that most of these markets, they like to consume podcasts globally. So they've actually been exposed to a lot of American advertisers that they don't actually have access to. So they hear these ads, but they can't purchase them, or they don't have access to them. So really you only have like a couple of seconds to let them know that these American brands that you're speaking of, that you're actually speaking to them so that they can act on it. Because otherwise they've kind of condition themselves to turn off when they hear American brands because they think that you're not speaking to their market. So just addressing them. And so I think that's why it's important to meet with these international, truly international networks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing we continually learn year after year, decade, now into our second decade, is what's most genuine is what works best on podcast. And so it's good to see that that's actually staying true to the down to the letter, whether you're in the US or traveling abroad. I
would hasten to add that for those that are actually listening, the clients that we actually spend in internationally are intentionally trying to get those impressions in those markets. So whomever has actually got that spillover and is not taking caution to either geo ring fence the podcast that they do in the US, and they're getting all those additional impressions without having distribution, then that's something they should be thinking about. But with regards to the businesses that we've worked on who've exported their advertising either into the UK, France, Germany, or any other host of markets that we're currently working in for a few of our key client customers, it is a notion that we've already sort of taken into account. I think that overspill of audience happens sometimes in nascent platforms as they're growing, but it's something we've always kind of tried to restrict and be mindful of.
And baked in ads too. So
yeah,
I think that's where the bleed over is.
Yeah.
And now transitioning, James, to a story that you had shared on your podcast Business Journal. But tell us about the state of, we've heard radio on the podcast, but we haven't necessarily heard podcast on radio yet until just now. Walk us through what's happening in this space.
Yeah, so there's going to be a set of new radio stations in the US called Podcast Radio. Podcast Radio have signed with a large US broadcaster. They're not quite saying who it is quite yet, but it's going to launch in 4 markets in early September, 2 of which are in the top 20 markets, which is interesting because that means that there'll be some quite interesting numbers for that. This is a radio station that's actually already existed in the UK, and the idea behind it is that it plays podcasts on the air. It has what they call pod jocks, so people who will actually announce each individual show that's coming up and help you through, and all of that. And I think from a radio point of view, that's a really interesting idea of a format to basically put some great speech content on the air. make that available, on the radio, so that as you're flicking through, trying to find something to have a listen to, which isn't angry white men shouting about other angry white men, then you might find something a little bit different on your radio dial. So I think that's very exciting. And that's set to launch. Now, you might remember that iHeart had some podcast stations that they ended up running. And I believe that some of those are still on the air. They weren't programmed very well, it has to be said. I mean, if you're listening to a radio station that's playing podcasts and it fades the podcast down to go into a news bulletin, you know that that's probably not the best plan. So they're going to be programmed in a very different way. And it'll be really interesting to see how they work in terms of audience figures.
And any notes on whether or not they'll be edited, or are they playing them in their original state?
My suspicion is that they will have to edit some of them for FCC rules. Now, I actually produce a version of the Podnews Daily podcast for podcast radio in the UK. And I used to be on the radio in the UK, so I know the UK rules pretty well. So if you're listening to the podcast radio version, then sometimes you don't hear a certain story. And certainly I'm not as free with my language as I might be on the other thing. So I suspect that there will be some editing there, and I suspect that there will also, more crucially, be editing around some of the advertising on there. There are rules and regulations certainly in the UK around what you can advertise and what you can't advertise, and my suspicion is that that will be part of the plan there. So the fact that you are advertising on a particular podcast doesn't necessarily mean that ad will be heard on the air. But I think certainly worthwhile taking a look at how they work. And I'm fascinated to learn which of those markets are actually going live with it. We'll find out very, very shortly, I'm told.
Well, until then, we'll all have to stay tuned, but something to watch for sure. As always, thank you, everyone. James, Stephen, Miranda, Ashlei, Julia. We've loved having you on the show. We know for sure you'll all be back, and the audience will be on the edge of their seats. But thank you all so much.
Thanks.
And now, for our fireside chat with Bambee CEO Allan Jones, titled Startup to Unicorn at the Speed of Sound. In this insightful dialogue featuring Allan Jones, the visionary leader behind Bambee, having an intimate conversation with our company's CEO and founder, Dan Granger, they delve deep into the role of instinct in decision-making, the importance of treating campaign funds as one's own money, and the unmatched value of friendships in the fast-paced world of marketing. So without further ado, Dan Granger and Allan Jones.
We've been talking about many things. When you're talking about attribution, when you're talking about creative, when you're talking about media, there's best practices. There's, you could create a rule book that would be largely transferable for any business that's represented in the room. But one of the themes I want us to close with is coming back to something we talked about earlier, and that's bravery. It's courage. Because at some point, you can have your pixel tracking set up as best you can. You can have your post-purchase survey set up, your second layer survey, which we can talk about. You can buy the right shows. You can have the right message. But if you don't have courage, it may not be what you want it to be. You can't just check the boxes, right? There has to be some risk. And so I think, as I've worked with probably hundreds of marketers over the course of my career, I think the ones that have been the most successful are the ones that got the data and also had guts. Because it's easy to take to just de-risk. Sometimes half of marketing is de-risking, right? But hopefully it's something more than that. The person that I'm going to introduce, I think probably embodies this as well as anybody I know. He has overcome pretty much any type of adversity you could think about. He was not born into a wealthy family or have a fancy education, but truly at the age of 19, went into tech and with no connections or anything, and just through sheer grit and will and some talent, hustled his way to some interesting companies. Some of you have heard of DocStock, which is now owned by Intuit, I believe. And then he moved on to a company called ZipRecruiter in 2013. That's where we got to know each other. And he and I had the benefit of working on a very, very small audio campaign, which started for tens of thousands of dollars of investment and grew into a 7-figure-a-month program. And everybody's heard the ZipRecruiter stories because they were such a big force in the early days of podcast. Since that time, after being CMO of ZipRecruiter, he went on to found another company called Bambee. And Bambee, if you don't have good HR protection, you know that can cause a lot of problems. But not everybody can afford HR. Not everybody's HR can do everything themselves. So Bambee is kind of the other side of the house from the recruiting end. This is about people management and being able to offer that to businesses starting at $99 a month, and with a large vision that I'm going to let him to tell you about, but it's really to restore dignity to the American worker. And he's been so successful with that. They have over 10,000 active customers and a tremendous growth story. A lot of great investors have come in, and he's just been a wild, wild success in that business. We've become friends over the last decade because we've worked together so closely and just gotten to know each other and liked each other in the process. And, we've been working with Bambee since they started doing audio. And so last year was a busy year for me. We had a lot of projects going on. And in the middle of all that, Allan called me and he said, hey, listen, I need an interim CMO for about 6 months, and I'd like you to come and fill that role. And I said, well, I do run an ad agency. I don't know if that's probably not a very good idea. Absolutely, I'll do it. So he's an innovative thinker, for better or for worse from time to time, but it worked out. And after all that, we are still friends. So please welcome to the stage my friend, Allan Jones. Right there.
Hey, everybody. It's actually not how that happened. So he said no, and then I said, well, don't say no. And I was like, well, just think about it. Can you at least just not say no? And he said, fine, I won't say no. And I said, great. Then the next day, I called again, and I was like, hey, yesterday you didn't say no. So it wasn't as clean as that. It took a little arm twisting, but we got there.
The guy can close. Let's put it that way. All right, so I think I got most of your bio right, but that's me telling it. I think it would be helpful for people to understand your background and just an overview of your career journey to go from, nobody from nowhere where the tech and business community is concerned to becoming truly a captain of industry with a company that's valued at how much now?
Closer to $500 million.
Closer to $500 million. Not too shabby.
Not too bad.
Okay. It's pretty good. And decorated. You keep getting awards. Goldman Sachs gave you an award recently.
They did. I was shocked.
So anyway, so how'd you do it?
How'd I do it? So, I'll tell you a little bit of the story. I almost never tell the story, so I'm just going to fucking tell it. I can trust you guys. I can see it in your eyes. I was a barista at Starbucks. I was 17. Then I was a teller at a bank. And then one day, my partner at the time was like, hey, let's go to a Mariah Carey concert. I went to a Mariah Carey concert in Vegas, and I met the director of engineering at a company called Helio. And her and I hit it off. And by hit it off, I mean sang really loudly after 7 cranberry vodkas. And she was like, hey, you're super smart. You should come work in tech. That is literally the start of my tech story. And I followed up with her every day for about 4 months. She did not respond. And eventually, I sent her kind of a terse email, that said something to the effect of, you shouldn't say things to people that you don't actually mean. And she responded. She was like, hey, man, sorry, I was on sabbatical. It's like, oh, fuck. It's like, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And I went and I interviewed, and now I started as a QA engineer in tech, 16, 17 years ago. Trajectory-wise, I then went to be the head of product at DocStock, as Dan talked about. Started my first company, raised money, venture-backed business when I was 23. After running that business as CEO for a number of years, went to go be the CMO of ZipRecruiter at the age of 26. 20 people at the company when I got there. Helped shape that company and put on the trajectory to ultimately go public. I was gone by the time they did, but there was 500 people at the company by the time we left. I was in charge of growth. There are a few people here that were on the journey with me. Leon in the back, who's my head of data. David Chow over here, who actually is just a friend now. Doesn't work at Bambee anymore. It's a shame, David. Come back to us.
Currently.
And so, it took a lot of us to get there. Ultimately, I left because I'm an entrepreneur. At ZipRecruiter, I'd never been a CMO before. I'm a builder. And so I left 7 years ago to build Bambee. It is actually our 7th year in operating this month.
Congratulations. So let's talk about when Allan met audio. How did that work? Because I didn't take you for much of a talk radio guy. I don't know if you listened to a lot of podcasts when we first met up, but what happened?
Barely even understood how podcasts worked at the time. What happened? So when I joined ZipRecruiter, I joined a company that had this really cool, interesting value proposition of like, post to 100 job boards in a single click. And I was like, oh, that's kind of a catchy tagline. The majority of their investment was in a different part of the business, the marketplace side. And so when I joined the company as CMO, I was in charge of subscription. To be honest, I think they thought that was a throwaway part of the business. I think that it was like half the founders didn't think they needed a CMO. The CEO wanted to hire a CMO. And they were like, yeah, just give him the job distribution part. And so Ian Siegel, the CEO, said, hey, look, if you can just increase the number of subscribers by 100 every month, that would be groundbreaking for us. I don't remember anybody. Do you remember how many customers? Leon, do you remember how many customers we did at ZipRecruiter a month? Almost 10,000. I got it. Sorry, it took me a second. By the time we left, we were doing 10,000 customers a month. And how did we get there? Well, I looked at digital, and nobody was searching for the product. No one was like, hey, how do I post to more than one job board in a single click? You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't something people were actually searching for. And so I thought, where is our customer? And so I had these 2 pilot programs that I wanted to run. Again, having never run a large marketing, campaign, worth anything more than $10,000 in spend, I went to the board and the CEO, and I was like, hey, look, here's what I want to do. Here's the demographic data about our audience. Here's what percentage of that audience listens to audio. Here's how we can run attribution to make sure we can track it just in the same way we do SEM. It's honestly no risk. Secretly, I didn't believe that last part. Like, I was fairly nervous. And then I got introduced to Dan. And then we started.
What was hard about making it work? Like, what were the challenges at the time? Because when you're a 20-person company, it's different than when you're a publicly traded company, or the founders have exited. Like, that wasn't the world you were in, right? And so it's a very different picture, and there's so much you don't know, and some of it is about, like, making the right choices, collaborating on copy, things like that. But then internally, what did you have to go through within the business even to get the support to do it?
Well, what was crazier is at the time, ZipRecruiter had not raised a dime of capital. It's totally bootstrapped. And so we were still living, we were 3 months away from missing payroll if we ever messed anything up in the numbers. And so getting the support was actually fairly difficult. So I did the pitch, and I went to Ian, and they basically said, if this doesn't work, we'll fire you. And I was like, yeah, well, whatever. Sounds good. Either, what is this about if I'm not here trying to drive growth? Like, I'm not trying to incrementalize our way to $1 billion company. And so I think there were 2 things to solve. One of them was getting the support of the board, getting the support of the founders. There were 4 of them. And the other was attribution. I also wasn't about to spend money somewhere where I couldn't track its performance. I just refused on principle. That may sound logical, but there are people who say, just spend it, and then ultimately, if your audience is there, they'll show up. Nah, bullshit. It's like, maybe, that may be true, but by then I'll be out of a job and we'd be out of money. And so for us, getting the attribution right was huge. At the time, we were using this like really fancy, I'm not going to say the name, Convertro technology company that got acquired ultimately by AOL, and they promised attribution. And so the big problem was, we'd spend $10,000 on these, this set of media, and this system would say, hey, if you double it, customers should double. And we double it, and customers wouldn't double, right? And so we did that probably twice. And then I basically said, we're not going to use this. And so my team and I built a homegrown attribution methodology, one that we could trust, that was Jimmy rigged. It was held together with duct tape and bubble gum and whatever else sticky. And, we made it work. Yeah.
And do you remember like your first adrenaline hit when you saw something work? Like I think we, as marketers, like, no, seriously, there's like a buzz that you can catch when you start a campaign and you've never done it before, or you take a big risk on something that's expensive, that's gonna hurt if it misses, and then it hits and you know that you've got it. Do you remember that?
Yeah. The reason I smile is I just haven't thought about that in a long time. It was the Rachel Maddow show, and it was one of the first buys we did. It was probably on Sirius. And as the data came in and returned and it said we had a customer, I was like, no. And so before I even told anybody we had a customer, I basically proved I just knew it was not true. And then the next day, we had a few more, and there were probably like 3 shows we were running where I could easily track the customers were getting back to the shows, and it was, it was super exciting. Yeah.
And Silicon Beach at that time, there was a lot going on in that environment. It was, there was the D2C revolution was on, and Zip had been largely bootstrapped, is my recollection. I remember while you were there, they set the record on the largest Series A. It was like 60 million, which at that time was really, really big.
63.
Correct. So how much of Zip's success in their run-up do you attribute to audio? I don't know how he's going to answer this, by the way.
It's like saying, like you have kids, you're proud of them, they graduate. It's like, who's more responsible, the mom or the dad? Or the dad and the dad? And I think you can't answer it that way. I think that, before I got to the company, they had laid the groundwork of building a compelling product that they just didn't know how to scale. And so without the compelling product and without the insights to build something so niche, like who would think that you could build a, $2.1 billion market cap, $3 billion on a good day, 1.2 in the last 12 months, market cap business on something that seemed so utilitarian and simple and straightforward, right? It's not revolution. It didn't, ZipRecruiter didn't promise to make all your hiring pain go away. We literally just zoomed into one thing we knew you had, which is you post a monster, Indeed, and LinkedIn, and then all of those, all of those candidates come into your email inbox, and it's impossible to manage them. It was that little insight to say, well, what if we let you post to all of them, then you manage them in ZipRecruiter? It was that little insight, and so I had nothing to do with that. What I had was courage. And courage, I don't say that to be overly confident. Courage is in some ways because ignorance is bliss, right? Like, I didn't know I hadn't extrapolated worst case scenarios of what would happen. Like, they were looking at the payroll. Like, I looked at it when finance showed me, but I didn't really care. I was still really eager to just make something work. And so, look, could they have built an amazing company without me? Absolutely. Would it have been a publicly traded one? Maybe not. And so I'd say that's where the distinction is.
So it was significant. Okay, so you're one of a few marketers that I've known who switched from being a head of marketing to a founder, entrepreneur, CEO. Right? It's a cool transition to watch. How did that happen? How did you go from that to saying, no, I'm going to do the whole thing?
So technically, I was a product person first, then a founder, then a CMO, then a founder again. And that is in part because I don't actually see, most of the problems in a business are very similar. They follow a similar set of patterns and frameworks. And so if you can deal with the discomfort enough in an area that may be unfamiliar with you, to you for long enough, you will start to recognize how that area is actually very similar to something else that you know. Most people jump at the discomfort, right? So as soon as you go from product to marketing, you're like, I don't know enough about this. This doesn't feel safe. I'm out of here. I actually fucking swim in the discomfort. Right? I have no problem feeling really uncomfortable for a very long time until it starts to feel comfortable in a new space. And to be honest, I think that's what being an entrepreneur is. Like, if you're, I don't really see myself as CMO of ZipRecruiter. Like, I was just an entrepreneur. I'd never run a marketing campaign before. I just knew how to solve problems. Like, the one thing, can I keep going for a second? The one thing that we discovered when I first got there was, I went up to the SEM manager at the time, and I said, hey, what are the LTVs for the company? And she was like, well, we're spending $200 to acquire them. And I was like, great. Different answer to a totally different question. What are the LTVs? And this is, I think before, now we all know LTV to CAC as a principle that we have to subscribe to. They didn't know the LTVs. And so we were like, how do you know how much you can spend if you don't know how much you're making back over the lifetime of the customer? And so using that, we then decided, I had never used that principle before. I was just an entrepreneur who studied a bunch of companies who cared about what made them successful. And then I applied that earnest curiosity into my roles there. So to me, it doesn't feel like I've jumped anywhere. It feels like I've had the same job for the last 15 years.
Well, can you just brief everybody on Bambee a little bit? Like, tell us that story. Why did you do it? And what is it and where is it going?
Why did I do it? A little bit of spite, which is good, I think, for motivation for everybody. I think, and a lot of energy. At ZipRecruiter, what I learned is there are 5.6 million SMBs in the US who are small businesses. The majority of them are still completely underserved in many ways. There are a lot of products that get built to try and service their needs, and a lot of those products don't make it to scale because acquiring them is difficult. Okay, well, say you get past the challenge of acquiring them. Keeping them on the platform is even harder, right? So notoriously expensive to acquire, notoriously difficult to retain. And so who would build a company in that space? But what I learned about that customer, not just through my childhood, my parents are small business owners, my grandparents are small business owners. I grew up in an SMB household, is how we made a living. My parents owned a pager store off of Atlantic Boulevard in Long Beach. My grandmother ran a childcare center. My other grandmother ran a Baptist church lady store with big purple church lady dresses, mostly black church lady dresses. She did not have a lot of foot traffic. Either she was money laundering or she was selling it on the side, but she made it work. What was the question?
Why did you start Bambee? Why don't we start with the mission?
That's right. Sorry. So I know the customer. And one of the insights at ZipRecruiter, and a thing that we got all the time in our call center, is someone would post a job, hire someone on the platform, and then they would call our call center and say, hey, I hired Dan, he's not working out, can you help me let Dan go? And we're like, well, no, we're a job. Nobody would ever do that. I would never let Dan go. But we were like, no, we're a job board. And that happened a lot. They'd say, hey, I really want to hire someone, but I have no idea how to write the job description. Or I posted the job, I've got all these candidates, but I've never done an interview. And so you had all this very clear qualitative data at scale that we were totally dismissing and putting to the side and saying, no, we're a job board. But, 29-year-old Allan Jones at the time thought there might be a really big business on the other side of that. And so I left, took a trip to Asia for 4 months, backpacked, and ultimately decided that I was going to build a company to solve that problem. When I started looking into the problem, it was even more compelling. It was, those same 5.6 million companies, not only did they not have any of those things, they had no HR at all. The biggest reason they did, and the penalties for not having HR, like Department of Labor claims, lawsuits, bad culture, harassment issues, they were clear and prevalent. And the number one reason they didn't have HR was because of price. And I thought, what a stupid problem, right? You got all these companies, all these problems, and the reason they don't have HR is because they can't afford to pay somebody $80,000 a year. Of course they can't, by the way. That's how much they make in a month, or that's how much they get in a quarter, so of course not. But if you can, through economies of scale, reduce the price and allow that resource to be shared, and then remove a lot of the fat by creating workflow technology and using some AI to answer some of the questions, you can build a really big company. And then I thought, and then if they trust you with their HR, you can actually sell them anything. So Bambee is today HR for small business, but we want the entire share of wallet. So HR, payroll, 401k, and yes, here's the spite, jobs.
So let's talk about the more human side of that. It's a great representation of the business opportunity, but what's the greater good that it's doing for people? Because I know that's part of the DNA.
Yeah, I mean, I think the part of this I missed is when I went to Thailand, I had this I got a bunch of tattoos and did a bunch of crazy shit. But I also I was having a quarter life crisis, right? I was like, am I using my superpowers for good? Am I a capitalist? Is capitalism evil? Should I be, is socialism good? All those questions. By the way, I'm a capitalist. But what I realized was if I spent the first, the tranche of my 20s to 30s building superpowers, that I would spend my 30s to 40s using my superpowers for good. In ways that did not abandon my ability to change the income and wealth creating opportunity for my own lineage and my own family. That is also important to me. And so Bambee would not exist unless I thought at scale it did a tremendous amount of good. I would have done something else.
Can you tell the story about your dad?
Yeah. Which one? The lawsuit one?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the earliest memory I have of this, I was 12. I came out of my room into the living room, and my parents owned a little grocery store, and they had fired someone, and the person was suing them. And my parents are African American, obviously, and the person that was suing my parents was also African American, and he had hired the NAACP to come after my parents for wrongful termination because of race. And so, some weirdness in there, but in that moment, I came out, it was so intense. My mom was in a bad mood. My dad was there talking to my uncle. They were talking about liquidating my college bonds, which I didn't need anyways. Couldn't go to college, but maybe that's why I didn't go. They liquidated the bonds, and they were liquidating my college bonds to pay for the lawyer. It cost $10,000, but it almost bankrupted our household. We didn't have that kind of money. And so you take that and you extrapolate it, you go forward to ZipRecruiter, and it was very clear to me that not only was this problem happening at scale, I still get chills when I talk about it. I know what it felt like to have the moment. And so on the small business side, we think removing a lot of the frivolous stuff out of their day-to-day only helps them build better companies, and we think supercharges the economy at scale. On the other side of that, we think there is a poor employee experience happening because most SMBs, most business owners, they want to make the right choice. They just don't know that they're making the wrong choice. Example, you work for me at a furniture store. You break one of my vases. That vase was going to be sold for $500. Seems logical that I would just dock your pay for the next 3 weeks until you pay it back. Happens all the time. Completely illegal. You're supposed to file an insurance claim, not dock his pay, because he makes $14 an hour and he'd be working 2 weeks for free. But stuff like that, well-intentioned people thinking they had a creative idea are actually harming some of the people that work for them and not knowing it. So we think Bambee is good for small business owners, and we think we reduce what we call paper cuts, moments of indignified experiences of the employees that work at those firms.
So Bambee today, how important is audio and with what you're doing for growth?
I mean, it's the heart of our growth strategy.
How is it different than other channels?
You can only have one heart. But it honestly, it supercharges so the thing about audio is you have to be confident around it. So for me, if I just spent a bunch of money and trusted Dan to just say, here's what's happening, it's all audio's driving all the growth, that wouldn't be enough confidence for me to continue being courageous to upspend. But audio for us not only has it given us the ability. So it's offense and defense. Not only has it given us the ability to speak directly to our customers and build a brand, we do it in a way where we power charge growth. Ads drive customers. Every ad, or we don't spend any more money, drive customers. But but there's also a halo effect, so it makes our other channels perform better, right? So SEM, Facebook, our other digital channels perform better because of audio, and that's measured scientifically to make sure that that is the case. So we know with every dollar of audio spend, what do we think the incremental value is we're going to get on another channel? So if I'm spending 1-to-1 on audio, I'm not spending 1-to-1. I know I'm spending $1, but I'm getting $1.20 back. And so, it's usually the last channel we cut, but also the easiest to prune because sometimes it's really obvious what's not working. But, I think the one way to make me upset at Bambee is to talk about cutting certain parts of our audio program. And the answer is almost always no.
Well, there's a couple places I want to go with that. One, can we talk a little bit about some of the work we did together on attribution last year? Because I think we broke new ground, and I think that there are some things that came out of that can help the group. Sure. And we even worked together on a white paper about it. So can you share what that was from your perspective?
I think you did the white paper more than I did, so you start, and then I'll follow.
Okay, fine. So here's what happened. So while I was doing,
okay, all right, fine, I'll do it a little bit. So just a little bit. Okay, so we had built this attribution methodology at ZipRecruiter, and I told you we built I was the largest buyer of audio in the United States. I spent more money than any other brand in North America, and we had an attribution methodology that was all based on. We used the exact same methodology at Bambee, and it was not as effective, right? And so that's it's a bit of a mind fuck, right? Because you're like, well, it worked to build $1 billion company. It is not proving to be as precise in my own company. Why is that? Well, what had happened over the 7-year period, is everything changed, right? There are a lot more buyers of podcasts. There are a lot more buyers at tech companies who notoriously would have never bought audio in 2013, now are very large buyers. And the other thing that changed is consumers got used to hearing something. So you'd say, go to Bambee.com/free to check out our da-da-da. And consumers would do that 30% of the time. Well, consumers got ad blindness too, and they stopped listening to the end of the URL, and their behavior changed. They would just go directly to Google the name, and so if you were using the URL for any attribution, it would no longer work. And so Dan came in, and we came up with a thing that we thought worked better. I'll stop.
Perfect setup. So here's what we did. The vanity URLs have not aged well. And David helped with this. A lot of people in the room helped with this. But what we figured out was the multipliers that we were using were crazy because we had the how'd you hear about us, the Heidi how. We had that standard practice, had the vanity standard practice. Here's the problem. If you've got an allowable acquisition cost that's hundreds or sometimes thousands of dollars, your sample sizes are very, very small. And so when we would do the multiplier and see it was 20 this week, and the next week it was 40, it's not very reliable. It's very hard to make data-driven decisions. And if you're going to optimize a campaign, most of us are not just pure brand marketers. We need to have the understanding to make optimizations on a show-by-show basis. So what we figured out is, we don't have to send people to these vanity URLs that they're not going to anyway. We can just build into the how'd you hear about us a second question. So if they choose radio, podcast, or really any of these fragmented channels, then you ask them another question, which was, what show or station did you hear us on? And instead of what brands did, I think, for a long, long time, which is serve people a list of 1,000 shows that you're sponsoring that nobody's actually going to pick from anyway, we just use predictive text. So we load in every possible combination of spellings and word counts and associations that might link back to that show. You type in 3 letters, now you can see, you click it, and our multipliers, we saw 720% improvement in the visibility of that. Allan was generous enough that he let us publish that for the industry.
And following our thesis, it stopped working. And so it would seem like all of a sudden you'd have this thing that should work, and one dimension away, this thing should work too, and it wasn't working. Now, it actually was working. The vanity URL strategy just stopped performing for us. And so you had to capture that customer traffic through your main sources, not assuming folks would go to vanity.
Here's what the other qualifier, because this stops a lot of brands from doing it. They're like, well, if we make them do a second question, are they going to abandon the process? So Bambee is very, very data driven. And what they said was, we're not going to do this if we're going to chase away customers and change our conversion rate. So we had to test this thing and make sure that customers were not leaving in the process. Conversion rates were flat. Nobody left as a result. Conversion rates did not change. We're running out of time. Yeah. So I want to ask you a couple final questions. Okay. You are very data driven. You have 1 million engineers and a very smart team. Always have, right?
My head of engineering is over there, so I looked at him. He's like, not 1 million. Yes, somewhere close to 1 million is correct.
Okay, but you're also a very intuitive person, right? And I've seen you lead from the gut all these years. So how do you balance the part of you that is risk taker, entrepreneur, lead from the gut, with also being data driven? How does that work in real life?
Easy answer. First 10%, last 10%. The gut can activate the first 10%, which is like a thought around something, somewhere to look. Right, I have an instinct that this might be wrong. I have a suspicion that this might. Data should drive the rest, and then in the end, when the data can't answer it, the gut can also close it. Right, it can be the final decision maker. I almost never though lead from the I almost never let my gut lead the entire thing. Almost never. I will also say that data does not have to be quantitative. That your brains have a really good way of taking qualitative data at scale and creating a gut instinct. So sometimes a gut instinct is literally just unprocessed data. And so what gets tricky is to not let your emotions get involved in that set of choices. But most of the time, your gut is telling you something, so long as it's not coming from fear, ego, or pride, that's usually data that should be good enough to make a decision based on. That is just my tree hugger, woo-woo way of looking at life, and it's worked for me so far. But yeah.
I think we need to close with this one. So when you see a room full of people that are responsible, their neck is on the line for an audio campaign. Maybe they're managing a number of campaigns in different channels, but there's a lot of risk involved in that. What advice do you have for them on how to be successful?
Spend the money like it's yours. I mean, and that means in multiple ways. It means if it was yours, how prudent would you be? If it was yours, how many follow-up questions would you ask to your agency? And how much would you have really trusted the first time they said this versus that? You would have really dug in, treat it like it's yours. That also means, on the upside, treat it like it's yours, right? Which is, hey, look, I want to get rich. And so I want to double down on this thing, and that takes a little bit of courage. And I have the confidence to do that because I was so thoughtful about looking into this, that I'm comfortable making this big bet. I would do this if this was my money. I think the trouble that marketers run into is they speak from a position of this ain't my money. And, they talk often about when you work, especially when you work at a big company, it's easy to be like, we have plenty of money. Even if we waste this $30,000, that's going to be fine. That's not what it's about. You're right. The company is going to be fine. But your success has to do with how in the moments of incremental decision making or big, bold decisions, you treated the money like it was yours and you made the bets like the returns would have been yours too.
How important are relationships in marketing as a brand? Can't you just do it all through a computer?
This is a very clear setup for audio, by the way. It's not that sneaky. I would say, well, obviously the answer is very important, right? There's the story I want to tell. Really important. At the beginning of the year, the markets went to shit. And we are a company we're a venture-backed business, high growth, high scale. And so like a lot of my peers in this situation, we use capital that comes from venture capitalists to fund the futures of our companies. Bambee is blessed to have a path to profitability over the next 9 months. And that's rare, but also makes the road ahead much more difficult. At the beginning of the year, I went to Oxford and I said, look, man, the markets have gone to shit and we need a much more profitable way to grow audio. And here's what I'm thinking. And he's like, great, here's what I'm thinking. And we went out to some of our partners and we pitched the craziest idea. crazy. Like, it's crazy, right? In a way that my dollar gets to work a lot harder every time I spend it. And I thought they were for sure going to say no. And then we get on a Zoom call. I'm not going to say any names. We get on a Zoom call, and it's people I've known for years, right? It's like two executives that took me to the Super Bowl 10 years prior, and we talked it through. I was vulnerable. I told them why we needed to do it. And they essentially said, okay, sounds good. And we got the deal, and it's been one of our best performing channels all year. That wasn't like a strong arm leverage situation, right? I didn't have a ton of leverage there. Some, right? I could have reduced my spend. It was a relationship. And you know who never returns my emails? My fucking Google SEM account manager. So, and so I think really, really important, specific, I will say, genuinely, I have learned over the years that for all of audio's benefits, the most valuable one is the relationship. And if you've not tapped into how to leverage that in a unique way, you're fighting the battle with one hand tied behind your back.
Allan Jones, ladies and gentlemen. We're grateful for our relationship.
Thank you, guys.
As always, this podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use influence for good. As members of our marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges instead of burning them, and to rise above our differences and show that collaboration is possible when we treat each other with respect. If you're a marketer looking to align with our vision, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Thank you to our guests, Ashlei, Julia, Stephen, Miranda, and James, and to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.